So I think it's a few things going on with American support or not supporting federal troops going into cities. Part of this is Trump's broader plan to be viewed as a law and order president. So he's continuing to signal dog whistles to his base, but also oftentimes loud sirens, from sending in federal troops to his statements about what it means for people to be low income living in suburbia. And part of thinking through this is that people who live in these cities do not want to be over policed. This is the reason why people are protesting to begin with. So of course they're going to be opposed. We also know politically that people who live in cities, particularly in major urban areas, they are more likely to vote Democrat. So they're going to be less likely to support what the president is doing. And then third, people who do not live in those cities and who are more conservative are going to be more likely to support what President Trump says and does no matter what. I think the bottom line is this. Trump knows that the only thing he can control are federal troops. He cannot control what states do. He cannot control what mayors do as it relates to deploying law enforcement. And what mayors are trying to do is to engage in negotiation for police reform with activists, with local organizations, with community members who want to see things get better. No one wants to see crime in their neighborhood, but they also don't want to see over policing and police brutality either. And for a lot of people who live in low income communities, that is the conundrum. That is what comes together, that they're oftentimes not getting good response rates from public safety, whether it be police officers, firefighters, or EMT services. And then they are more likely to be policed and profiled in those same exact neighborhoods. Having more troops there and having more law enforcement there is not what they want to see. What they want to see is police reform that leads to them getting the same type of quality service that people in the suburbs do and people in predominantly white neighborhoods do.
So although many Americans are troubled and very concerned that Trump is sending in federal law enforcement to cities, I believe they're mistaken in their perception that that's necessarily illegal. While the issue of sending military troops or any types of military personnel to engage in domestic law enforcement is more clear cut in the law that is generally unlawful with some exceptions. But when you're dealing with federal law enforcement like DHS, like DOJ, Transportation Security Authority, Customs and Border Patrol, many FBI, the lines aren't that clear cut. And what's important to note is part of the war on terror, part of the consequence of the war on terror is that the federal government became much more involved in domestic law enforcement with the cooperation and the blessing of local police departments. So you have the joint terrorism task forces, you have the state fusion centers, and you have local police working with federal law enforcement, the FBI in particular, in countering terrorism, which tended to focus on Muslim and Arab and South Asian communities. But what happened is this normalization of these relationships such that it's difficult to now turn around and say, oh, well, federal law enforcement has absolutely no jurisdiction and they cannot go into the cities, when in fact the American public welcomed federal law enforcement when they were surveilling Muslims and mosques and Muslim student associations. As we saw, for example, with NYPD mass surveillance, they were working with the FBI, right? They were working with DHS. We see it in immigration enforcement. So those citizens who are concerned about federal law enforcement infringing on the jurisdiction of local police need to then also question the war on terror regime that has been created, that has essentially created that infrastructure to make it very easy for the federal government to spy on American citizens and to utilize local police forces or sometimes even replace them in investigations and in prosecutions. So I think it's important for people to understand that and to know that the war on crime and the war on drugs and the war on terror are interconnected, and there are infrastructures in place between local and federal law enforcement such that when we realize there are abuses, it becomes much more difficult to have a check on them. And as a general matter, the reason why policing is a state matter and a local matter is because you have more ability to check your local police department democratically. It's much more difficult to hold accountable federal agents whose orders come from Washington, D.C. So there is a logic to that. It's part of the states' rights doctrines and federalism principles. So if we're not comfortable with that, then we have to dissect and deconstruct the counterterrorism war on terror regime that is entrenched throughout society as a result of the last 20 years. And it is a product of both Republican administrations under Bush and Democratic administrations under Obama. So this is a bipartisan problem. And I hope that the heightened attention to local law enforcement in terms of state-sanctioned violence against African-American communities will also open conversations about state-sanctioned violence and surveillance and civil liberties infringements against Muslim communities, against Latinx communities in the immigration enforcement, and make people understand that everything is interconnected.
In recent weeks, there's been a radical movement to defund, dismantle, and dissolve our police departments. Extreme politicians have joined this anti-police crusade and relentlessly vilified our law enforcement heroes. To look at it from any standpoint, the effort to shut down policing in their own communities has led to a shocking explosion of shootings, killings, murders, and heinous crimes of violence. This bloodshed must end. This bloodshed will end.